Hello and welcome to the Gaggle Wobble Challenge, and if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Szamuely, and I just want to record a podcast on current developments in Ukraine. As you know, there's a lot of excitement in the media and among the usual alt media, internet influencers about the protest, the first protest we've seen in a while in Ukraine over a piece of legislation that has just been signed by President Zelensky. And these protests are taken to be a sign of Zelensky's inherent political weakness, a sign that the West has now had it with Zelensky, and that something like a color revolution, another Maidan, may take place in Kiev, and that Zelensky will be thrown under the bus. These predictions have been made many, many times over since February 2022, and with these signs of protest, young people coming out on the street protesting Zelensky are taken to be the sign that Zelensky's number has finally come up. So it's a very, a strange way of interpreting events. What happened was that this legislation that has been signed brings the anti-corruption agency Nabu under the control of the Prosecutor General of Ukraine. In other words, it brings it under control of the central government. Nabu was created in the aftermath of Maidan as supposedly this independent agency to investigate corruption in Ukraine, that all the bad old days of corruption under the likes of Yanukovych and Kuchma, they're all gone now. There'll be rigorous investigation of corruption. Now, of course, Nabu never did any of that. Corruption continued to flourish, but Nabu did enjoy the protection of the West. If you recall, Nabu made sure not to investigate Burisma, in which, of course, Hunter Biden served as a senior official, though he never actually went to Ukraine and he knew nothing at all about the energy industry, but collected a cool million a year in salary. And if you also recall, in 2016, it was Nabu that was instrumental in the downfall of Paul Manafort, because it was Nabu that presented almost certainly forged papers suggesting that Paul Manafort, President Trump's campaign manager, he wasn't the president yet, it was the 2016 election, his campaign manager, had been taking off the ledger payments from Yanukovych's Party of the Regions. That caused a stir in the media, and that led to the firing of Manafort. Nabu was behind all of that. And if you recall, also during the impeachment of President Trump, there was supposedly it put pressure on Zelensky to find out incriminating information about Joe Biden. On the scene came all these figures who were very active Americans who were active in Ukrainian politics, and they were all really working on this whole program of rooting out corruption in Ukraine. That was, you remember George Kent, and then of course there was Marie Yovanovitch, who was the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, and she also, she was a real absolutely passionately committed to the cause of fighting corruption in Ukraine. And she was asked by Congressman Jim Jordan about her work with Nabu. And of course, she was unable really to answer any questions. So she was this indefatigable fighter against corruption, but she was unable to name a single individual, a single company that she had encouraged Nabu to go after, or that Nabu had actually gone after, even though she had made sure that Burisma was not gone after by Nabu, but she was this corruption fighter was unable even to name for Jim Jordan the name of the person who was the head of Nabu, and that really gets to the heart of what Nabu is. Nabu was a creation of USAID and all the Soros organizations. These people, the USAID, the Soros organization, use Nabu as a means of exerting control over Ukrainian politics. So naturally, Zelensky, who wants to tighten his grip on power in Ukraine, would want to remove all figures who would be serving somebody else and would somehow exert control over him. So when he removes people and brings things under his own control, that would surely suggest that he's consolidating power, not that he's about to be overthrown, but so wedded figures, and particularly in the alt media, to this thesis that Zelensky is about to be overthrown any minute now. He's a goner. That even when the evidence is there that he's consolidating power, that he's appointing people who are basically loyal only to him into key positions of power, they always take that as indication that his days are numbered. But what I think is most important is to remember that Nabu, because it's essentially was a creature of USAID, which is pretty much being wrapped up in the United States by Donald Trump, and a creature of Soros, and a creature of the Democrats. It worked essentially with the Democrats in the United States. Because of that, the United States under Donald Trump could not care less what happens to Nabu, and which is why I think Zelensky doesn't have very much to worry about, despite the apparent distress that this has caused on the streets in Kiev, and a little bit of distress in Europe. No distress at all in the United States, because Trump doesn't care about that. So let's just take a look at some of the stories and some of the overwrought coverage that this is receiving. So here is Politico earlier this week. Yeah, of course, that's exactly. Sorry, this was nice. Sorry, now let me go back. And that's yes. So just bear with me. Yeah, this should be it. So here's the story in Politico earlier this week. It says Ukrainian lawmakers vote to scuttle independence of anti-corruption agencies. And it says the EU says it is concerned about the Kiev parliament passing the controversial bill. And then he says the Ukraine's parliament voted decisively on Tuesday in favor of a bill that critics say fatally undermines Kiev's commitment to tackling corruption. Now, Kiev has had no commitment at all to tackling corruption. Everybody has known that corruption is rampant and rife and has been throughout the Zelensky years, throughout the Poroshenko years. The new law brings the independent, Nabu, and the Special Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office, or SAP, under the oversight of the Prosecutor General of Ukraine, a political appointee of Zelensky. And then the Ukraine's SBU, State Security Service, launched a series of raids on Nabu on Monday as part of a probe into suspected collusion with Russian spies right before the bill was passed. So, of course, what do you do with your political enemies? You just call them Russian spies or Russian agents. The EU, which has staunchly supported Ukraine in its resistance against Russia's full-scale invasion, said Tuesday afternoon it was concerned about the vote in Kiev. And then they quote this European Commission spokesperson, Guillaume Mercier, who says these institutions are crucial to Ukraine's reform agenda and must operate in an independent way to fight corruption and maintain public trust. And then here's the Kiev Independent that describes this legislation. And it says the step comes as Ukrainian authorities ramp up pressure against the two agencies established as part of the anti-graft reforms after Maidan. And then the bill was passed with the support of 263 lawmakers, with 13 voting against and 13 abstaining. So that doesn't look to me as if Zelensky is in a lot of trouble. This legislation is passed with 263 in favor, 13 against, and 13 abstain. So that's a majority. The legislation now is on the way to Zelensky for signature, and in fact, he's already signed it. And under the new bill, the Prosecutor General has the authority to issue directions to Nabu's investigations or even reassign them outside the agency. It would also allow the Prosecutor General to delegate SAPO's powers to other prosecutors. And then, among other new powers, the Prosecutor General could also close Nabu's investigations at the legal defense's request. And then Ruslan Kravchenko, appointed Ukraine's Prosecutor General last month, has been described by experts as a figure close to President Zelensky. So again, he's consolidating power. Last week, he appointed a prime minister who's a woman whose loyalty is exclusively to Zelensky. Watchdogs have warned that if adopted, the amendments would hamper the two agencies' investigations into authorities or individuals close to the president. And then Nabu issued a statement that the changes would amount to the destruction of Nabu and SAPO's independence and practically subordinate their activities to the Prosecutor General. And then Ukraine's anti-corruption infrastructure, built since 2015, will be destroyed. And then, again, the Nabu director saying it threatens Ukraine's Euro-Atlantic integration. And then speaking at a press conference, he voiced hopes Zelensky would veto it. Well, that was a fairly forlorn hope. This is effectively the end of the work of two independent institutions. Said this is the head of the SAPO. And then they said on July the 21st, law enforcement agencies carried out sweeping searches of Nabu and SAPO. 15 Nabu employees are under investigation on various grounds. The SBU justified the raids by citing suspected Russian infiltration and administrative misconduct, with allegations ranging from traffic violations to treason. Well, that's quite a gamut of allegations. One Nabu employee was detained on charges of spying for Russia, while another is accused of involvement in drug trafficking and ties to pro-Russian groups. Now, and then it says earlier this month, the State Bureau of Investigation charged Vitaly Shabunin, Ukraine's leading anti-corruption activist and co-founder of the Anti-Corruption Action Center, with fraud and evasion of military service. Charge he denies. And And then they quote, the international partners are unhappy. Now, you have to keep in mind, these crackdowns and this fairly brutal way in which Zelensky's authorities treat Ukrainian citizens, dissenters, whatever. That's par for the course. And the EU has said nothing, the media have said nothing, and whenever these issues come up, they always say, well, there's just simply Kremlin propaganda, Kremlin talking points. Now, they seem to have changed their position because they're, for once, getting their talking points from the Soros organizations, because they're the ones who have a vested interest in Nabu, always did have. Nabu was created by USAID in partnership with Soros. So they're the ones who are feeding this information to the media, and they are again aligned with the Democrats in the United States, and they are aligned with various figures in the European Commission. This is what they care about. Grabbing people off the street and sending them to the front as cannon fodder. Well, no one cares about that. Closing down political parties. No one cares about that. Closing down media on the grounds that they are pro-Russian, or they present Russian news or entertainment shows. No one cares about that. But if you tamper with the agencies who are tasked with keeping Ukraine under the control of, whether it's the Democrats in the US or the European Commission, that's a different issue. And suddenly the media come out swinging. Here's a columnist on Bloomberg, Mark Champion. He says, Ukraine has a self-inflicted handicap in its war for survival. Corruption threatens European aid for arms. And for anyone who, like me, has traveled in and out of Kiev since it gained independence in 1991, let alone Ukrainians themselves, this is all deeply frustrating. The country has one of the strongest civil societies in the world. I mean, this is the quality of the commentary you get. One of the strongest civil societies in the world. Time and again, Ukrainians have shown extraordinary courage to defend the rights they believe should be theirs, mounting 2 successful revolutions and defending against Russian invasion for more than a decade. Despite all this, and enormous progress on reform since 2014, corruption remains this country's kryptonite. Ukraine does by now have some of the strongest anti-corruption institutions in the world. Nabu hasn't done anything. I mean, the whole idea that it's actually done something and actually cracked down on anything, led to the prosecution and imprisonment of any corruption. None of that. It's all made up. But as Valeria Ivanova, a visiting senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund think tank, put it to me, that's thanks to the persistent efforts of reformers backed by international partners. And just because the system now exists doesn't mean it's protected from political interference, especially in wartime when the government wields emergency powers. And it goes on, the US, which used to take the lead in pressing Kiev to tackle systemic corruption, suddenly appears disinterested. Sorry, bit of a bête noire of mine, a kind of a distraction. Incorrect use of the word disinterested. The correct word here is uninterested. Disinterested has a very different meaning. It means when you don't have an interest in something, like a financial interest in something, then you are disinterested. The reason I bring this up is the low quality of the writing that you get at Bloomberg, where somebody's writing a column and doesn't know the difference between these disinterested and uninterested. But anyway, back to this. But Zelensky should avoid the temptation to abuse that space. Europe is very much interested. Its taxpayers are now asked to pay not just for US weapons on top of their own aid for Ukraine, but also for as much as $19 billion a year to activate unused production capacity in Kiev's defense industry. Zelensky needs to make sure he does nothing to undermine confidence among his bill-paying Western partners that the money they gave for Ukraine's defense is well used. Otherwise, he'll quickly move from being an asset to his nation's war effort to a liability. Now, all of this is utter nonsense. Europe is heavily invested in Ukraine. There is nothing Zelensky can do to untangle the European commitment to Ukraine, short of going to and signing a peace agreement with Moscow. That's the only thing that might upset Europe. Europe is now thoroughly committed. You know, I was talking about these sums. They're committed to sending more and more money to Ukraine. They have not the slightest intention of cutting the flow of funds and weapons, because it's the European leaders, whose reputations will be on the line. They are the ones who are going to be punished for having wasted so much money on Ukraine, on wasted money on someone that they suddenly will have to say, yeah, we didn't know that he was so corrupt. You know, we sent hundreds of billions of dollars to Ukraine. Turns out they were corrupt. Well, wow, what do you know? So, in other words, that hundreds of billions of dollars, you were just sending into a sinkhole. This is taxpayer money, European taxpayer money, you were handing over to people you now say are thoroughly corrupt. In other words, all that money was just looted and stolen in no time at all, and then they came back to ask for more. You can't. Well, Europeans are not expected to, admit that. So of course they will go and continue to send aid to Ukraine, arms and aid to Ukraine. This is, the fact that Zelensky brings Nabu under the control of the central government, it's not going to change any of that. And then here's the Economist: outrage in Ukraine as the government attacks anti-corruption watchdogs. President Zelensky tightens his control. Few deputies could remember a law of such importance being rushed so quickly through Parliament. The passage of Bill 12414, which subordinates Ukraine's two main independent anti-corruption bodies to the presidentially appointed prosecutor general during wartime, had the feel of something done in panic. Really? What's the panic? It's just bringing it under control of the government. Unveiled at a hastily convened committee session on July the 22nd at 8 a.m., neither the committee head nor the majority of members were present. By the afternoon, the bill had been rushed over to the president for signature. Zelensky's men had been able to find the numbers so to comfortably pass the bill, and with 263 voting for and 13 against. But the vote to undermine Ukraine's most consequential anti-corruption reform casts a shadow over the country's future course. Ukraine has been building up to this moment for several weeks with what appears to be a growing crackdown on internal dissent. Now remember, internal dissent has been cracked down on for years. For years. They never bothered. This never really made it into the Economist or the Financial Times, and we're going to see the Financial Times in a minute. They're cracking down on the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. They're cracking down on media, cracking down on political activity. None of that ever made it. But you go against the sort of the Soros outfits and the Sorosites and the power of the NGOs, then you suddenly get the media getting very agitated. In early July, the government blocked the appointment of Alexander Tsivinsky, a well-regarded detective, to the vacant position of director of the Bureau of Economic Security. That was followed by what appeared to be the politically motivated arrest of Shabunin, this anti-corruption activist. In mid-July, a shakeup of the government promoted Uber loyalists including a new prime minister. Then, on July the 21st, the Domestic Security Service and the Prosecutor General's office launched dozens of raids targeting officers at Nabu and Sapo, and so on. And then you can see here, but the government's decision to launch a full frontal assault on the Maidan-era reforms implies that something sinister is at work. Sources suggest that the trigger for the bill may have been the opening of Nabu investigations into the dealings of presidential office insiders. Well, maybe that may well be, but it's also the case, as The Economist points out, that Zelensky is tightening his grip on power. He's centralizing control to himself and his cronies. And then here's this commissioner, EU commissioner enlargement. They're always sending out these tweets. Marta Kosh, seriously concerned over today's vote in the Rada. The dismantling of key safeguards protecting Nabu's independence is a serious step back. Independent bodies like Nabu and Sapo are essential for Ukraine's EU path. The rule of law remains in the very center of EU accession negotiations. And then The Guardian here says, Zelensky defends bill stripping anti-corruption bodies' independence amid protests. And then move by Ukrainian president widely opposed and may prove a setback to hopes of country one day joining the EU. Now, let's remember, there's a lot of talk about the country joining the EU. Now, nobody seriously believes that Ukraine will join the EU anytime in the near future. I mean, it simply cannot happen. And it's not just because of the opposition of Hungary. It's the opposition of almost every member state of Europe who don't think that Ukraine is in any condition to meet the EU standards. And in many countries, farmers, construction workers, truckers would all be very concerned about unfair competition from Ukraine, now one of the poorest countries in Europe. This whole thing of EU accession talks is all being driven by a kind of anti-Russian animus and the creation of this notion that the EU is welcoming of new members. Let's remember, there are any number of countries who have been waiting in line to join the EU, who are much more or much better qualified to be EU member states than Ukraine is, and they have no hope of joining the EU anytime in the near future. I'm talking about Serbia, Montenegro, North Macedonia, Albania. I mean, any number of those countries in the Balkans. They've been waiting patiently to join the EU. This whole thing, this accession talks, are purely a political weapon to be used against Russia, just like Moldova. Moldova is supposedly being fast-tracked into the EU. It's not going to happen, but it's being used as a means to in the case of Moldova in particular, to remove any Russian influence from them. And of course, to play along with the EU desires, but no serious prospect of joining the EU. Anyway, here says Zelensky has defended his approval of a contentious bill, and then he says, the move on Tuesday has put the president on a collision course with civil society activists and some of Ukraine's veterans, as is likely to dismay Ukraine's European partner. Now, there's a number of articles like this, all suggesting that somehow these protests, getting people out on the streets, is the first signs, the harbingers of some kind of a color revolution. Whenever you get young people who are suddenly out on the streets. I mean, if you think of, young people in their 20s, I mean, most of the time, what are they most interested in? Well, their phones, playing with their phones, playing video games, going to bars, restaurants with their friends. That's what young people the world over are mostly concerned with. So suddenly, when they're out on the street, you think, well, why are they suddenly so um, agitated? Really? This is what they care so much about? Nabu? That Nabu, which isn't being outlawed, Nabu will cease to be an independent agency, but will come under the control of the government. That's enough to get young people out onto the street. Well, of course, the way you get them out onto the street is, through the rent-a-mob organizations run by Soros, and that's really evidence just that this whole thing is being stirred up by the Sorosites. And that's what of course, they did in Georgia as well. Massive, but Georgia, you had massive demonstrations against the adoption of the kind of FARA legislation, that's Foreign Agents Registration Act legislation. Here it's over Nabu. Now the demonstrations have been very small and nothing like the size of the demonstrations back in 2013, 2014 during the Maidan days. One of the reasons why I think young people are going to be reluctant to come out and protest is that they might get arrested, and this is a real danger in Ukraine, they're going to be mobilized and sent to the front. So I don't think many people are going to be out on the streets protesting, getting themselves into a confrontation with the police, and then finding themselves kitted out and sent to the front. I think they're going to stay home and make sure that they're well out of the way of the police. But the media want to present this as if somehow we're at the dawn of a new Maidan. And on Tuesday, Ukraine's parliament passed a controversial bill sweeping new powers. And then late on Tuesday, Zelensky signed the bill into law, rejecting calls to use the veto. And then in his nightly video address issued well after midnight, Zelensky said he had spoken with the Nabu chief, Simin Krivonosh, and other top prosecutors. Anti-corruption bodies, Zelensky said, would continue to function, but without any Russian influence. That's wonderful. It all must be cleansed. There must be more justice. Of course, Nabu and Sapo will continue their work. It's important the prosecutor general be committed to ensuring real accountability for those who break the law. This is what Ukraine truly needs. And then here's again Politico, stirring things up. Bills in Ukraine as Zelensky signs law targeting corruption watchdogs. And then again, these protests grew across Ukraine on Tuesday night as President Zelensky approved the law that scuttled the independence of Ukraine's anti-corruption agency. And then hundreds of people demonstrated in cities, including Kiev, Lvov, Dnipro, and Odessa. How many? Hundreds of people. Hundreds of people is nothing. I mean, just notice how this, this huge avalanche of media coverage is basically hundreds of people across a number of cities: Kiev, Lvov, Dnipro, and Odessa. And you can only come up with hundreds of people. And then here's this Anastasia, 21-year-old biology student. This is fucking outrageous. War has brought so many tragedies to it, but it was also a signal that our country is fighting for better. We can't let it backslide, and so on. You get her out, and then she's just outraged by whatever. And then New York Times: wartime protests in Ukraine targets Zelensky for the first time. The demonstrators were angered by government moves to dismantle anti-corruption efforts. And then here the Times says thousands of people, which is very, I saw some of the pictures. They didn't look like thousands of people. That looked like 150 or so. That definitely not, even hundreds was a bit of a stretch. But thousands of people gathered in the streets of Kiev in Ukraine and so on. The protests outside the president's office in central Kiev. So all this time, they haven't protested the war. They haven't protested the mobilization. They haven't protested the crackdown on media, crackdown on dissent, crackdown on political parties. They haven't protested the crackdown on churches. But suddenly, the fate of Nabu gets people out onto the street. Amazing. Um, and then it says, activists and analysts see the legislation as part of a broader crackdown on independent news media. Voices critical of the government and government oversight group, both public and private, threatening hard-won progress toward democracy. This is democracy where Zelensky has now been in power since 2019, so it's now been well over 6 years. It's more than a year has elapsed since he was supposed to run for president. That was canceled, but that's democracy. One of Ukraine's most prominent anti-corruption activists, and then Vitaly Shabunin, we talked about him. He was being charged with evading military service, and then here we have here's the Times, the crucial paragraph. The crowd grew on Tuesday evening as the sun set on a hill just above Maidan Square, where more than a decade ago, crowds gathered to protest the corruption of the Kremlin-aligned president at the time, Viktor Yanukovych, leading to his ouster. So they're bringing up, obviously, as a number of these media stories, they're trying to bring back memories and trying to warn Zelensky that, hey, look what happened to Yanukovych. This could happen to you if you go against the Soroshites. Now, and then here's the FT. Ukraine's reform of anti-corruption bodies puts EU accession at risk. And then Ukraine President Zelensky's controversial move to take control of his country's anti-corruption bodies poses a risk to European funding and Kiev's path to EU accession. Now, as I've said, it poses no risk to funding. Because the funding, the Europeans and the Americans have all committed themselves to continued funding. It was unconditional funding. They've never said, well, if Zelensky adopts this legislation, then that's it. No more howitzers, no more money, no nothing. I mean, they haven't said that, so they've pretty much given him, Zelensky, a blank check. And as I say, EU accession is a non-starter. It's not going to happen. So the idea that this is going to make EU accession difficult. EU accession was already impossible. And then it says Zelensky signed the law, puts the prosecutor general and so on. And then the move, which the president said was aimed at rooting out Russian spies, has sparked condemnation from the EU and G7 members. And then it goes on. EU Economy Commissioner Valdis Dombrovskis, who oversees financial assistance to Ukraine, told the Financial Times the two bodies are crucial to Ukraine's reform agenda, and they must operate independently to fight corruption, to maintain public trust. And then our current financial assistance to Ukraine is conditional on transparency. No, it is not conditional. It is not conditional. There's never been the slightest indication. No, nothing has been said that it's conditional on anything. It's an unconditional commitment, which is why Zelensky feels so confident in doing whatever he does, in consolidating power and actually grabbing more and more power for himself, because it isn't conditional. And the same is true concerning Ukraine's path towards EU accession, that will require strong capacity to combat corruption. And then French President Emmanuel Macron, European Council President Antonio Costa, they said, spoke with Zelensky this week to urge him to rethink the reform, and the people briefed on the discussion told the FT. And then the G7 ambassadors in Kiev issued a joint statement on Tuesday saying the group of advanced economies were closely following the issue and that they have serious concerns and intend to discuss these developments with government leaders. Now, it has to be, and then Zelensky has sent out, his tweet, relax, cool it. He says, I gathered all heads of Ukraine's law enforcement and anti-corruption agencies, along with the prosecutor general. It's a much-needed meeting, frank, constructive conversation that truly helps. We all share a common enemy, the Russian occupiers. Defending the Ukrainian state requires a strong enough law enforcement and anti-corruption system, one that ensures a real sense of justice. Criminal proceedings must not drag on for years without lawful verdicts, and those who work against Ukraine must not feel comfortable or immune to the inevitability of punishment. Now, as I said already at the beginning, why does he feel that he can go after Nabu in this way? Because he knows that Trump absolutely loathes Nabu and what it stands for. He remembers Nabu and during the impeachment hearings and the role it played, because Nabu cooperated with Jovanovic, and Jovanovic was working with these various Ukraine politicians. This is really before Zelensky, with the Poroshenkoites, against Trump. This was really the sort of the center of anti-Trump activity that was going on in Ukraine, and it was all done with the collaboration of Marie Jovanovic and Nabu. So Trump hates these people. They are USAID. They're exactly the people that he's been wanting to get rid of from the U.S. government, and that he is now getting rid of. They're the people who are at any National Endowment for Democracy. They're the people at the National Democratic Institute. They're the people at the International Republican Institute. The Freedom House. All of these organizations. It's the same crowd. It's they're getting money from USAID. They work together with the Sorosites. And so Zelensky knows that going after Nabu will only win him brownie points with Trump. And that's why all the talk, and particularly in the very silly article written a few days ago by Seymour Hersh, that somehow Zelensky's days are numbered, are so completely off the wall, because Zelensky is actually in a much stronger position than he was months and months ago, because months ago, when it looked as if somehow Trump wanted to get rid of him and Trump didn't like him and he was out of favor with the new people coming in Washington, Trump, J.D. Vance. And then I think, Zelensky at superficially at least, or on the surface at least, it looked like Zelensky may be in trouble and that a replacement will be found for him. But since then, Zelensky's relations with Trump have greatly improved. He has signed this extraction agreement with the Trump administration, whatever that's going to amount to, but Trump seems to like the idea of this, what he calls a minerals deal or a rare earth deal with Ukraine. He signed that, and Trump has now committed himself to selling weapons, whatever he wants. The Patriot systems are on their way to Ukraine, even as we speak. Germany is sending, I think, 5 Patriot systems to Ukraine. So Trump has done that. And if Zelensky tells him, hey, I'm getting rid of your political enemies, these were the people who were plotting against you back in the days of Biden, and then back in the days when you were first president, that's only going to please Trump. This strengthens Zelensky's hand. So I think it's it's striking that, in fact, there have been no noises coming from the United States condemning Zelensky, even the usual gas bags like Kaya Kallas and Ursula von der Leyen have kept their silence. So I think anyone who's going to tell you that this is the beginning of the end for Zelensky, you should ask them, what they're smoking. Anyway, thank you very much for listening. And remember, if you like the gaggle, please like, share, and subscribe. See you soon. Bye-bye.